In the roaring decade of the 1920s, Florida was a place of boundless promise, land was the new gold, and the Florida land boom brought speculators, settlers, and fortune seekers in waves. Swamps were drained, canals were dug, and new towns seemed to spring from the earth overnight. At the center of this transformation was Lake Okeechobee, its name from the Seminole words for big water. Along its southern and eastern shores stretched miles of deep black soil, rich with nutrients deposited over centuries. Locals called it muck, and to farmers, it was as good as treasure. Here, celery, beans, and sugarcane could grow in near-endless cycles, untouched by the harsh winters that gripped the northern states. This promise drew two very different groups. On one side were ambitious land developers and farmers eager to stake their claim in this agricultural frontier. On the other were the thousands of laborers who made the vision possible, African Americans from across the rural South, and Afro-Bahamians who crossed the sea in search of steady work. They formed the backbone of the Glades workforce, doing the backbreaking labor of clearing, planting, and harvesting. Life in these lakefront towns, places with names like Belle Glade, South Bay, and Pahokee, was a mix of hope and hardship. The labor camps were built quickly, often from scrap wood and tin. Drinking water was drawn from shallow wells, and sanitation was primitive. But for many, the land offered something worth the toil, the chance to earn a living where crops could grow all year long. Standing between these settlements and the vast lake was a narrow earthen barrier, no more than 5 to 8 feet high. Built from the same muck that fueled the farms, it was never engineered for a worst-case scenario. In 1926, the Great Miami Hurricane had already sent a surge over the lake's edge, killing roughly 150 people in the town of Moore Haven. It was a grim warning that the barrier was dangerously inadequate. But in the feverish optimism of the time, the dike was only patched, not rebuilt. By the summer of 1928, the lake was already swollen from weeks of heavy rain, its surface 3 feet higher than normal. The canals that carried water away from the glades were running full, leaving no room for more. The land and its defenses were saturated. All they needed now was a push, and far across the Atlantic, that push was already on its way. By the afternoon of Sunday, September 16, 1928, the Okeechobee Hurricane had already proven it was one of the strongest storms the region had ever seen. After tearing across the Bahamas, it roared toward the Florida coastline with winds estimated near 156 miles per hour. The storm reached landfall just south of Jupiter Inlet, its massive eye spanning over 25 miles wide. Residents who had not evacuated found themselves in homes shaking apart under the violent gusts. The first communities to feel the full force included West Palm Beach, Canal Point, and Belle Glade. Roofs peeled away like paper, telegraph poles snapped, and heavy rainfall quickly overwhelmed the drainage systems. In some areas, more than 10 inches of rain fell in just a few hours, causing streets to turn into fast-moving rivers. People clung to anything sturdy they could find as debris hurtled through the air. The hurricane's winds were only part of the danger. As it pressed inland, torrential rain began raising the level of Lake Okeechobee. The shallow lake, already swollen from a wet summer, could not hold back the sudden surge of water, driven by the storm's pressure and winds. Entire fields of crops, mostly sugarcane and vegetables, were submerged in muddy floodwater within hours. Livestock drowned in barns, and transportation lines were cut, isolating communities from outside help. By the time the storm's center moved westward across the lake, much of southern Florida was in chaos. Communication lines were down, leaving survivors with no way to call for aid. The full scope of the disaster, however, would not be understood until the floodwaters around Lake Okeechobee reached their deadly peak. By the early morning hours of Monday, September 17th, the full force of the hurricane had reached Lake Okeechobee. The storm's winds, still near 140 miles per hour, pushed a massive surge of water toward the southern shore. At the time, the lake was surrounded by a low earthen dike, built in the early 1920s, but it was poorly engineered and never meant to withstand such a storm. As the wind drove the lake's waters higher, the dike began to crumble. Around Belle Glade, Pahokee, and South Bay, the surge burst through the barrier with terrifying speed. A wall of water, in some places more than 20 feet high, rushed into the surrounding farmland. Entire communities were swept away in minutes, leaving little more than scattered debris. Families who had sought shelter in their homes or small wooden buildings were caught without warning, and many drowned before they could escape to higher ground. The floodwaters spread for miles turning sugarcane fields and citrus groves into an inland sea. In some areas, the water lingered for weeks, making rescue efforts nearly impossible. Survivors clung to rooftops, trees, or any floating debris they could find. The storm's fury was so great that some buildings were lifted from their foundations and carried far from their original sites. The breach at Lake Okeechobee marked the deadliest phase of the storm, transforming it from a coastal disaster into one of the most devastating inland floods in United States history. Those who lived through it would never forget the sound of the rushing water, the howling wind, and the darkness that came when all electric lines were destroyed in an instant. In the days following the 1928 Okeechobee Hurricane, the true scale of the disaster became clear. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, and miles of farmland were buried under mud and debris. The floodwaters that had spilled from Lake Okeechobee took weeks to fully recede, leaving behind stagnant pools that quickly became breeding grounds for disease. Malaria and other waterborne illnesses began to spread among survivors who were already weakened by hunger and injury. Relief efforts were slow to arrive, partly because the storm had destroyed many roads and rail lines into the affected areas. The Red Cross, local churches, and volunteers from across Florida began organizing supply shipments of food, clean water, and medicine. Temporary camps were set up to shelter those who had lost their homes, though conditions were harsh and overcrowded. The state of Florida appealed to the federal government for assistance, and military units were deployed to help restore order and aid in recovery. Soldiers and volunteers worked tirelessly to retrieve the dead, repair damaged levees, and clear the wreckage from streets and farmland. Despite these efforts, many rural communities felt forgotten, struggling for months without steady support. The disaster also spurred a broader conversation about the need for stronger flood control measures around Lake Okeechobee. Engineers began surveying the damage and proposing plans for improved levees and drainage systems to prevent a similar tragedy. While these improvements would take years to complete, the 1928 hurricane had already left an indelible mark on Florida's history, one that survivors would never forget. In the decades after the 1928 Okeechobee hurricane, the disaster became a permanent part of Florida's history. For many years, there were no official memorials for the thousands who died, and most victims, especially Black migrant farm workers, were buried in mass graves with little recognition. It was not until the early 21st century that historical markers and ceremonies began to honor their memory. The storm also led to major changes in how Florida prepared for hurricanes. The most significant was the construction of the Herbert Hoover Dike around Lake Okeechobee, built by the United States Army Corps of Engineers during the 1930s and 1940s. This massive levee system was designed to prevent another deadly flood, though over time, it has required constant repairs and upgrades. The tragedy pushed both state and federal governments to invest in better warning systems and evacuation plans. In the years following the hurricane, the Weather Bureau, now the National Weather Service, expanded its communication networks, making it easier to warn coastal and inland communities about approaching storms. Today, the 1928 Okeechobee Hurricane is remembered as one of the deadliest natural disasters in United States history, second only to the Galveston Hurricane of 1900 in terms of lives lost from a tropical cyclone. While the Herbert Hoover Dike has reduced the threat of catastrophic flooding, modern engineers warn that the lake and surrounding areas are still vulnerable if a major hurricane were to hit again. And for many residents, the legacy of the storm is not just about destruction, but also about resilience. The communities around Lake Okeechobee rebuilt from almost complete devastation, and over generations, they have kept alive the stories of survival and loss. The hurricane's memory remains a reminder that preparation, respect for nature's power, and acknowledgement of all victims are vital when facing the forces of the Atlantic.